Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we are going to be checking out the results of the Kyoto Champions League, which happened on the 23rd and 4th of December, just before Christmas, and it was a really interesting tournament actually. They're pretty much one-to-one with our standard format as well, so it is worth noting as we do still have a few more regional events in this format. We have the breakdown here of the top 16 decks, and already some things will jump out at you in terms of the success of certain archetypes. Certainly the top 4 Gholdengo Palkia I have my eye on. I've already started to playtest that a little bit over the last couple of days online, and we'll be doing a video on that archetype in general pretty soon. Also, the top 8 Arc Zeroara V-Star. It also played the V-Max and a Flying Pikachu in there as well, so an Arc Path deck up in the top. Generally floating towards those top tables, there are a couple of Gardevoirs. There's a good amount of Charizard, actually. There's one Charizard Pidgeot that made top 8, 2 others that made top 16, and a Charizard Bibarel, so that is continuing to do pretty well. There's a Gatey Lost Box, as well as an unknown Lost Box. We don't quite know what's in the top 1660 just yet. And also a couple of Lost Tinas, so the Lost Zone engine is still thriving and still going deep into tournaments. A very interesting Roaring Moon making second place, I think. A lot of skepticism, cynicism around Roaring Moon in general in the West, because it kind of flopped to the LAIC and ever since has really sort of not had that breakout result. It's had a couple of good respectable top 16 finishes actually, but hasn't really gone that deep into a tournament. So seeing a list that's quite different from our own lists that we'd already come up with make second place might give players more encouragement for this archetype going into the next few tournaments as well, which is going to be an interesting dynamic to follow. We do have some deck lists to actually look at in greater detail. I did just want to say thank you for PokeStats for amassing some of these deck lists, but also it's going to be a lot of it from the Pokeka book website, and also you can check out the live stream on the Japanese channel. I'll leave a link in the description down below. You follow the channel link and then just go to the live section. You should be able to find these pretty easily, and I know Azul has also done a post commentary of a number of these games. I think at the very least all of day 2 and the Top Cut games as well, so it should be easy to follow that content if you want to see some of the gameplay of how some of these wackier archetypes function. That's certainly up to you, but the victory came for a sort of Lost Zone toolbox kind of Tord-esque, where it has the cornerstone of Iron Hands and Roaring Moon as 2 of the multi-prize options. It does have a Raikou V and a Forest Hill Stone in the deck list as well. So you have a Forest target, which can give you access towards, obviously, Chorus, which is huge. This list isn't playing Lost Vacuum, so it's kind of like a slow 7, I suppose. Possibly choosing to go second a lot with this archetype will be pretty important, actually, so you can get an early Chorus in to actually get gating on turn 2. Otherwise, without Vacuum, it's a bit of a high roll to get towards that 7 threshold, but with only 1 Sableye, you're less pressured to, like, ramp to 10, I suppose. So that could be a reason why it's made way. It is playing a Kyogre in the deck list as well, which is quite interesting because you play 10 total energy in terms of basic energy and 1 jet. So it really is skimpy on counts to try and make the Kyogre work. I suppose it's going to be a matchup-based type card where you're going to use this only a couple of times in a couple of situations, but not necessarily every game. You're going in with a plan of using Kyogre, which we have seen in a few different instances in the past. It's made the space for a couple of gusting cards, actually, 1 Counts Catcher and 1 Boss's Orders. You don't always see these in Kyogre-based lists, but I also think this is a nod towards the other attacking echelon that you have available to you. It has essentially a 5th Comfey with that Ditto, which is kind of interesting, just because it is that important to get flower selecting from the get-go, that giving yourself those extra percentages is better than playing any additional Ball Search cards. We're already at the 4 Nest, we're already at the 4 VIP. It plays an Artisan as well, so Ditto seems to be just the next step in terms of making sure you have your ratios as high as possible. So getting into the game, especially, you know, Japan is in a best-of-1 format, so a 3,000 player tournament where you can't brick, Ditto seems like a good inclusion, so that's a really cool one to see. I wonder how many people are going to take this on board compared to Tord's approach that we've already seen, and in many ways Christian Hodas's list that was incorporating the super effective glasses and Tropius and whatnot. It's a bit of a different take and a bit of a more reduced package, I suppose, of attackers, so this is definitely an interesting one to keep an eye on. In second place then, it is a Roaring Moon list that is incorporating a 1-1 line of Darkrai V-Star. In order to use that V-Star power, getting back to item cards from the discard pile, we see the cross switches as well as cross transceiver here. Cross transceiver allows you to play 2 of them at once, similar to the cross switches, but it's allowing you to get a Pokemon or a supporter back from the discard pile, making sure you just have a constant chain of Sada. Allows you to have Iono or Boss on the spots when required, and means you can quite freely Pokestop these sorts of cards away without too much drawback, which is nice. And naturally, you just have fairly high hit points with Darkrai as well, which is low-key okay into the Lost Zone decks where you just want to have a punching bag in the opening stages so you can sponge some early, cram hits and whatnot. So that's also pretty interesting, but overall it's still a very turbo-y shell. Obviously with quad Pokestop you are really leaning into really high ratios with this list, so you're hitting a lot of draw power just from your stadium. You have Luminion to help cherry pick supporter, you have Squawk to get into the game, and overall Roaring Moon does still cover a huge portion of this format and is still very consistent and fast. So yeah, it seems like it's been undersold for how good it actually is in the format, and I think there will be people once again gaining confidence and trying again with Roaring Moon because yeah, another huge result in a massive best of 1 tournament with a fast deck in format as well is quite promising, I would say. Onto the other deck, which has been grabbing the front pages, it's going to be the Gholdengo Palkia. This is the one that really interested me because when I initially started playing Gholdengo in the format, it was with an Irida package actually. When I was trying out the Irida package, I was trying a thin Baskia Legion line in the deck list so that you could pay retreat into a Gather the Crew option just for early setup and had a single prize attacking option. However, it seems like the Milotic just protecting from hand disruption is the best case scenario that you have in the deck list. And we're going for 2 retreat cost Gimme Ghouls in here just for the extra hit points, which is, I suppose, reasonable with some Valiant still hanging around in the format. This just seems to be the safest option that you have. The Palkia, I've been playing around with this list actually. The Palkia is really nice just to give yourself a potential different beat stick. It can kind of be lower maintenance because you can just spend early energy in the discard pile via Greninja and whatnot. The Palkia, of course, powers itself up, still does a decent amount of output, so can get through certainly some, basic EX Pokemon and V Pokemon pretty happily. It has great synergy with the Irida, so you can threaten cross-switcher a lot earlier on in the game as well, which I think is a big combo and one of the sort of flaws of Gholdengo in general, where if you're just so reliant on constantly amassing energy every single turn of the game and recovering energy every single turn of the game, you don't always have those opportunities to weave in the Gust. So the Irida plus Palk combination actually makes that Gust potential a lot more live, which I think is excellent. But of course, you also have the upside of Star Portal allowing you to open up a line of Greninja, which completely changes the dynamic of how your opponent has to play around you. They have to spend Ball Search on Manaphy on the opening stages. If not, you're going to immediately pounce on them and punish them, which is exceptional. Some other really interesting calls in here, the Quad Pokestop as well as Quad Worker, so just saying no to Path every single turn of the game because your entirety of your draw power comes from Greninja and Gholdengo. Obviously, it has logical sense, but we haven't often seen a list that leans this heavily into 8 bounces. That's a really huge count. But that, of course, is in parts because the Pokestop can hit other Pokestops or could hit your workers. And in this list, we play no recovery for those sorts of supporters, so that is interesting. I really like the Roxanne choice over Iono. I know it's a -1, good early game supporter, I suppose, but it is such a great card to play in the late game because sometimes you're still fishing for pieces. You want a Roxanne, but then still have a superior at the end of the turn so that you can actually deal enough damage with your Gholdengo to make the whole thing work. So from what I've tested so far, I don't think this is the absolute perfect nailed 60. I haven't quite put my finger on what I want to change with the deck list, but I think this is certainly close, and there's a lot of elements that are correct here. I feel like a Hisuian Heavy Ball is pretty much a no-brainer with the amount of one-of cards that are so vital to the deck list, and because you play Irida to cherry-pick a Hisuian, why wouldn't you try that sort of card? Plus, you don't mind any excess jank, because you have so much discard in the deck, actually, with Quad Superior, 3 Ultra Ball, and 2 Vessel. It feels like you're naturally just going to thin these cards if ever they find their way into the hand. Just having, dead cards aren't actually the case because you're always actually looking for fodder throughout the entire game. So that's a card that I'm trying to work into the deck list. It's not crazy expansive with Gholdengo in terms of reaching. It's really quite on the low end of like resources to actually get your energy out. It plays 1 letter and 2 vessel. So sometimes you're using Pokestop aggressively just to get rid of your energy cards, because banking those energies is the best way for you to get access to Superior. So yeah, really interesting deck list. And again, Gholdengo right now, in terms of matchups, I actually think it's pretty okay into Charizard. I think it's pretty good into Miraidon as well. And it's pretty good into like the Rapid Strike stuff. I feel like it would have game into Mew as well, which I think is pretty solid. There are probably going to be some more dodgier ones out there, but the Milotic does give a great dimension to this deck where you don't just get disrupted out of games and can actually hold hands and build game plans, which I think is a really solid thing for Gholdengo and promising for the future as well. I think this is a really, really top contender post-rotation, actually. It's a video for another day, but I've already been looking at the F-on format because it is soon approaching, and I think Gholdengo is really, really promising in that meta. But for now, yeah, really encouraging signs that Gholdengo, might have a place in our metagame as well. The other top 4 deck was a DTE build of Mew. It does play 2 copies of Fusion Strike Energy. This is mostly so you can defend yourself against Spiritomb, which is fantastic. But it is mostly, the 3 copies of Path, the 3 copies of Judge, as well as the Iono in the deck list, giving you a lot of defensive plays. Make your opponent brick at times and try and pounce on that. I think this still gives you some of the best defense against Charizard in the format, which gives you the most balanced matchup spread I would expect. So yeah, cool to see that. It's incorporating a Cleansing Gloves, which we haven't seen for a while, but it can be really good at Psychic Leaping into Confe still. Still pretty good against Guardy, can be reasonable in Mirror as well, so it does still see some value. It's playing double box as well. This is just another good card for, again, Gardevoir can be good for Charizard as well at times, so just a generally pretty solid option to have in the deck list. Unfortunately, we don't have all of the top 8 lists in front of us, but we do have the Valiant Rapid Strike build, which I think is pretty cool. This was one of the archetypes that I had massively on my radar at the start of the Paradox Rift format. It was kind of debunked from being this like really top contender because it is quite an all-in archetype and it's a little bit fragile to a few things here and there. But comparing it to like the Entei Valiant, the sort of upside of playing Rapid is that you get to play Town Store for really good access to Forest Hill Stone so that you pop off into games that little bit more frequently, whereas the Entei build is more heavily linked to Magma Basin, of course. The sort of trade-off is you're not playing basic attackers, you're playing your Rapid Strike Urshifu in here. It is playing Luminous Energy, so you still do get to play Charizard, which I think is pretty cool. It's not quite as easy as an offset attacking mon in terms of a prize map, because your opponent can go through a 3 prize or a 2 prize around the Charizard, so it's not always necessarily that good, but it's still some of the most efficient damage that you have available in the game, so I do think that's still solid. This displays a few more supporters than you would expect in a deck like this. It's not playing any Trekking Shoes, but it is playing, a pretty high count of supporters overall with 11 total in the deck. For a deck that's pretty much known for being turbo, this is actually a lot of supporters jammed into a deck, but it still has the space for, maxing out the switching cards, really decent amount of search in the deck list as well. So it's not exactly lacking much. I think it is just like no Trekking Shoes in the deck list with the trade-off of just having more supporters overall, which I think is pretty solid ultimately. Entei Valiant has been struggling a little bit of late, so possibly it's time to go back to the Rapid build instead. So many stories from this tournament. The Arc Lightning Box is yet another one of them, which I think is super interesting. It's playing a Ditto in the list as well, which I think is so crazy when you play so few switch outs. Like, you literally only play this Ditto for extra percentages in your opening hand so that you start with an Arceus. I think that's so strange when you already play 2 Pikachu that are free retreaters anyway. This gives you 7 ways, essentially, to get your Arc into the active position pretty early on, so you can get those early Trinity charges, but essentially it's because every other ball search option is terrible for Arc. Outside of playing like VIP Pass, you're maxing out your Ultra, you're maxing out your Nest, nothing else really matters, so yeah, Ditto somehow has found a way into this deck list, which I think is absolutely wild. Once again, Judge Path is just doing the thing. We've seen it with Mew in top 4. Arc has also made it all the way to top 8. It still is a massive win condition in the TCG, especially with so many Lost Zone decks being, quite powerful. Having this much disruption against them is just so frustrating, especially with this much bulk. I can see how this is a bit of a pain. It plays Quad Iono as well as the Judges. You're just non-stop putting your opponent down into these awkward hand sizes. It's got the Quad Boss in the deck. It's got some research research in here as well. Another interesting card is the Cancelling Clone. I think this is to combine with the V-Star. Let's refresh our memories on what these Zeroauras do, because it is playing a 2-1-1 split of the V-Max and V-Star. The Zeroaura V-Star has 270 hit points, has free retreat, which is actually kind of nice. So you're Flying Pikachu V, V-Max, and this Zeroaura all have free retreat, which is pretty busted. The Crushing Beat does 119, discards a Stadium. I don't think that's that massive. But the Lightning Storm Star, I think, is the key reason why it plays this Zeroaura V-Star. You choose one of your opponent's Pokemon 4 times, and you can choose the same Pokemon more than once. For each time you do 60 damage to it. Such an interesting V-Star power. I think it can be quite strong into Lost Box. I think it can be certainly quite good into Gardevoir as well, because they heavily damage some of their own dudes. You can bring up the Manaphy, clone it, suddenly take out the Manaphy whilst also taking out things they've heavily damaged, this, that, and the other. Even just setting up damage onto some of their other attacking Pokemon can nullify them from being attacking threats altogether. So yeah, it's a very flexible V-Star power. It's difficult because you can't use Arceuses, of course, which is obviously a very, very powerful V-Star power that you would expect to use in most games. But if you're giving yourself the opportunity to weave this in, yeah, it's a certainly powerful V-Star attacking option. And then we have the V-Max, which has the Reactive Pulse attack, which does 60x the amount of your opponent's Pokemon in play that has an ability. Yeah, this can be pretty powerful into a number of matchups. We know abilities are rife right now. Against Gardy, Charizard, it's going to help you break through a lot of the basics in the Lost Zone box matchup as well. So yeah, there's so many reasons why this can still deal a good chunk. Definitely Mew has to be cautious of this card also. Yeah, pretty powerful option to have here. And the Max Fist does 240 damage, discarding 2 energy from this Pokemon. Not ideal. You can put double turbo on here though and still pay that cost and hit 220. Going through a basic V Pokemon, which I suppose is something. We've seen that before with like Duraludon being a partner, being really crucial that you can just boss and take 2 prizes with a big V-Max, and you know, if you can take that hit and deal another 220 the following turn or whatever, it can be huge. So yeah, they're not like the strongest attackers, I suppose, but they have utility. They have weakness on Pidgeot as well, which I think is one of the bigger things, to be honest with you. They're difficult to play around for certain archetypes, and when you have this as well as the strength for Flying Pikachu, you actually cover a decent number of matchups. So these Pokemon haven't seen really any play in the West, but yeah, they serve certain niche purposes and are difficult for your opponent to play around in a best-of-1 situation. Onto the top 16, we have a Charizard list with that Pidgeot in here. It's playing a TM Devolution, which I think is really interesting. Actually, both of the Charizard lists, I have the other one here as well that we'll look at in a second, were playing a TM Devo. I think this is a mirror tech card to really switch up the situation for the opponent and be a real nuisance for them, which I think is super interesting, honestly. It's not really something I'd thought about before, but yeah, it can be really, really detrimental. Previously, we'd seen Azul playing Justified Gloves as like their mirror tech choice, but now seeing a TM Devo as a potential different line is pretty intriguing to me, to be honest with you. This is once again one of those deck lists where it's not playing any switch card whatsoever, and because you don't play any switch cards, you don't play the Radiant Charizard. That's one of those things you have to either make 2 spaces for, or make those spaces to just have, you know, the additional Counter Catcher, the additional Super Rod, those sorts of things in the deck list. It's not things you always see coming to the list, but it's that choice that you make to cut to the Radzard to make space for some of these other like kind of luxury pieces along the way. Interestingly enough, the other Charizard list that I believe got 9th actually was, like I said, still playing the TM Devo, but was choosing to play the Radzard Rope package, which is kind of the thing that go hand in hand with one another. But both the most successful Charizards were playing the Rotom V, and this one is playing a bit more of a smorgasbord of supporters rather than playing like a heavy Arven package. It's just playing 1 and 1 Avery. So a few differences here, but again, the same core concept. And I thought it was really interesting to see double Devo pop up, which is really cool. Also, there is a new Charmeleon. I do actually have an image here, a translation from justinbasil.com, where it prevents all effects of attacks used by your opponent's Pokemon done to this Pokemon. Pretty nice option, definitely an upgrade for a Charmeleon, but it's a card that we're likely getting in our Jan set, Paldean Fates, so keep an eye out for that card. It's a small upgrade for Charizard, but I think you can be fine rocking Zard, obviously, without this inclusion as well. We don't yet have the top 8 Giratina, but we do have the top 16 list, and something really interesting about this Tina is that it's choosing to play Cleansing Gloves, so it's a tech card for Mew as well as Gardevoir, so certainly respecting those 2 archetypes. Outside of that, not too different from what we've seen over here in the West, honestly, where it's playing the high count of these Disruption supporter cards, it's playing the Counter Catchers and Bosses in really high counts, so lots of gusting available, and it's playing a very thick line of the 4-3 Tina as well. That's one thing where oftentimes we are sticking with the 3-3 count and go for a fourth nest ball. But outside of that, it's more of Tina goodness, to be honest with you. Nothing too outlandish about this list. Another arc had a very promising placement in top 16, this time with Giratina, an old chum, where it also has the Big Barrel Squovit as a fullback package. Again, quad Judge, quad Iono, quad Boss, just the good stuff. Put your opponent on those bad hand sizes, make them draw well throughout the entirety of the game. This is a really, really high count of energy as well. It's playing 15 total with 5 basic Psychic and 5 basic Grass. So you're constantly thinning the deck of these basic energy. You're not missing that turn 1 energy attachment. This one's playing a Capturing Aroma in addition to the Quad Nest, Quad Ultra Ball. Yeah, Arctina, still a deck, still putting your opponent behind that checkpoint of you gotta draw good, otherwise you're not going to win the game against me. And yeah, even though I think this is pretty weak generally into Charizard, I suppose Judge Path can sometimes do things, and that's always going to be something. You always have a chance with Judge Path. So the other deck list we have of the top 16 are the 2 Gardevoir players. Nothing too kooky about this one. It's choosing to play the Moonlight Hill Stadium, which again I have a translation for here. You can discard a basic Psychic from hand. If you do, heal 30 damage from each of your Pokemon. This is like a multifaceted option. It can, help you defensively, getting around like Sableye damage. It can help you push your Gardevoir, of course. It can help you reach 300 with your Arcana Gardevoir, even without the help of Reversal Energy. That little bit easier as well. So yeah, the Moonlight Hill is probably going to be a one-off stadium in Gardevoir like we see it over in Japan when we eventually get it in Paldean Fates. It's playing the Double Counter Catcher. This is actually looking like a really, really standard 60. I think the only things that stand out to me is that it's playing a 3rd copy of Arcana and not playing like a Jirachi or anything like that. And it's not playing a Lost Vacuum, but honestly, outside of that, it's a really, really straightforward 60. It's playing Triple Candy as well. I think this does respect somewhat the Miraidon players, which actually there were none in top 16, interestingly enough. So yeah, it's a fairly standard Gardevoir, and just playing the good stuff and drawing well, and that's the key idea. The other list was a little bit more interesting, subbing out to the Zacian V for the Luxurious Cape, and again, having a really weird line of supporters, choosing to play no research this time, but instead playing the Worker, the Avery, the Miriam, and the Zinnia's Resolve in the deck list, which is kind of kooky. This one actually played no Moonlight Hill whatsoever, just played an extra copy of Artisan, and did not play Battle VIP Pass. They were playing the 4/4/4 Ball Search with the Artisan in the list and the 2 Rare Candy. So a completely different engine, really, to what we just saw previously. So they're still rages on with that debate of which is going to be the better choice for you, and it may be a little bit of player preference because it seems like it can do well in every which way. And before we go, the senior winning list was just a Rapid Strike box, just a couple of tidbits really. It's playing a Drapion rather than Spiritomb in the deck list. It's playing a Town Store and just some one-of tools rather than some extra copies that we've seen in some of our Western lists, so this could be a way for us to cheat a little bit of space in our builds. Outside of that, it's looking pretty similar to what we've seen success with over the last few weeks and months, so pretty close to what we're already used to be honest with you. But yeah, that's going to do it for the Kyoto Champions League. If you haven't looked back at any of those games, some of them really were interesting, so I do implore you to do that on the official channels or from Azul as well, giving his own takes on things, which is always great to listen to. I'm really interested to see how people take these results on board or not. Are they going to trust Roaring Moon and put that back on their testing table? Are they going to bring back some Judge Path shenanigans from the Arc decks? Are we going to see Gholdengo Palkia making a bit of a resurgence as well? Because I know that everyone wanted Gholdengo to be good and it kind of just didn't get there so far, but maybe there's still time. Tournament or 2 for Gholdengo to shine before we have our rotation. Let me know your thoughts on today's video. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you tomorrow for another one. Cheers.